A few weeks ago, Professor Jiang did something unusual. He stepped outside geopolitics. He started talking about the end times. And for about 10 minutes, he was doing fine. Then he delved into religious eschatology. And I must admit, this is the area where his expertise is, let's just put it this way, not as shiny and prominent as geopolitical analysis is. I've spent 30 years studying Christian eschatology. This is my first education. And Christian missions, world religions, comparative philosophy, and ideological crossfire were the subjects I concentrated on. I don't say this to brag. I say it because what follows is not opinion dressed as analysis. It is analysis, the same kind we do here every week, applied to a subject most serious commentators are too nervous to touch. Jiang isn't nervous, I'll give him that. But nervous and wrong are two different problems. So today we're going to go where Jiang went, and go further properly this time, with the evidence, the scholars, the geography, and the structural logic that most people, including Jiang, have either missed or avoided. 3 threads, 1 episode, and by the end, a picture that is going to be very difficult to unsee. Thread 1. Professor Jiang argues that in order for the third Jewish temple to be built, the famous Muslim sacred place, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, must be destroyed somehow by an earthquake or something extraordinary. I disagree. Al-Aqsa can and will stand where it is. Let me explain. To start my argument, let's review where in ancient Jerusalem the old Jewish temple actually was located. Thread 2, who is actively trying to trigger the end times and why that is a geopolitical fact, not a theological opinion. Thread 3, what the mark of the beast from the book of Revelation actually is, and why the answer that keeps circulating is almost certainly wrong. And woven through all of it is Iran, Persia, the geography of prophecy and modern-day war news, and a question that has been nagging serious analysts for years. Why does everything seem to be converging now? So, buckle up, let's find out. 3 scripts and 1 stage. Before we get into the threads, I need to give you something most analysts skip entirely. Context. Theological context. Because without it, the 3 threads that follow will feel like isolated observations. With it, they will feel like what they actually are. One picture, being painted by 3 brushes simultaneously in 3 different traditions that developed largely independently of each other. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam each have what theologians call an eschatology, the teaching about the end times, a framework for how history concludes. Most people have heard bits of these. Very few have sat with all 3 side by side. When you do, something startling happens. They are describing the same events from different vantage points, in the same geographic territory, with the same approximate sequence. Let me walk you through each one briefly, respectfully, and then I will show you the overlap. So, the first one, Christian eschatology, the Great Tribulation, and the Second Coming of Christ. In Christian eschatology, particularly in the mainstream Protestant and Catholic traditions, the end times unfold in a recognizable sequence. A period of global tribulation, unprecedented in scale. A world government emerges, a single system of economic and political control. A figure rises who is described as the Antichrist, who bears many names: the Assyrian, Nimrod II, Cyrus II, the great world dictator, the one who names himself a god, who consolidates power, demands worship, and operates a system that no one can participate in economically without accepting his mark of loyalty. The third Jewish temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem. This is explicitly described in Apostle Paul's second epistle to Thessalonians chapter 2 and the book of Daniel chapter 9. The Antichrist enters and declares himself divine, the event Jesus called the abomination of desolation. Then the return of Jesus Christ, a war centered on the valley of Megiddo, called Armageddon in northern Israel, the judgment of nations, the establishment of a 1,000-year reign. Key geography is Jerusalem, the Euphrates River corridor, the valley of Megiddo, Babylon mentioned explicitly in Revelation chapter 17 and 18 as the seat of the final world system. Key preconditions already on the checklist: Israel reconstituted as a nation, Jerusalem under Jewish control, global governance, architecture in development, a cashless economic system technically feasible. So, Jewish eschatology, the Messiah and Gog and Magog. Jewish eschatology, drawing from the Tanakh, the Talmud, and the Maimonides' formulation of the 13 principles, describes a different sequence with significant overlap. The Messiah arrives, not a divine figure in the Christian sense, but a human leader with extraordinary capability who unites the Jewish people, rebuilds the temple, and ushers in an era of universal peace and knowledge of God. Before that arrival, the ingathering of exiles, Jews returning to the land of Israel from the four corners of the earth, meaning from all over the world. According to the vast majority of views, that process began in 1882. It accelerated in 1948. It continues today. Most traditional rabbis will tell you that box is largely checked. There is also the War of Gog and Magog, a final conflict in which a great northern coalition invades Israel and is supernaturally defeated. The ancient book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, describe it in specific geographic detail. A coalition from the north involving Persia, modern Iran, among others. Then the temple, rebuilt on its original site. The sacrificial system restored, the Sanhedrin reconstituted. Key preconditions: the Temple Institute in Jerusalem has manufactured every ritual object required for temple worship. The priestly garments, the golden menorah, the altar of incense, the red heifer required for ritual purification before temple service, has been bred and certified multiple times in recent years. The last piece of the preparation checklist. Key geography: Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, or as we will see in Thread 1, the City of David. The Northern Coalition Corridor, the same land. Now, Islamic eschatology, the Mahdi, Isa, and Dajjal. Islamic eschatology, drawn from the Quran and the Hadith traditions, both Sunni and Shia, is perhaps the least known of the three in Western analytical circles, and it is arguably the most operationally active right now. The Islamic end time sequence begins with the disappearance of the Mahdi, the guided one, the righteous leader who emerges in a time of global chaos and injustice, unites the Muslim world, and establishes just governance. He is then joined by Isa, Jesus, not as a divine savior in the Christian sense, but as a prophet who returns, confirms Islam, and defeats the Dajjal. Who is the Dajjal? The Dajjal is the deceiver, the great fitna, the figure who appears with extraordinary power, claims divinity, and leads masses of humanity astray. He is described as one-eyed. He emerges from the east. He commands a following drawn by miracles and material promise. He is the closest Islamic parallel to the Christian Antichrist. Then the defeat of the Dajjal by Isa. Then a period of universal justice. Then the final signs: the sun rising from the west, the beast of the earth, the great fire, and the day of judgment. In Shia theology specifically, and this is directly geopolitically relevant today, the Mahdi is a specific individual, the 12th Imam, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari, who went into occultation in the year 874 AD, who is believed to be alive, hidden, waiting, and whose return is preceded by, here it is, a period of extreme global chaos and injustice. Which means, in certain streams of Shia theology, creating chaos is not a problem to be solved. It is a precondition to be fulfilled, in some factions to be welcomed. Key geography: Damascus, Jerusalem. Isa descends at the white minaret east of Damascus, according to Hadith. The Levant, Khorasan, eastern Iran, and Afghanistan as the origin point of the Mahdi's emergence. The Euphrates River, the same stage. So, the convergence, and the question you might want to ask. Now sit with all three side by side. All three expect a final conflict centered on the same geography: Jerusalem, the Levant, the Euphrates corridor, and ancient Persian territory. All three describe a messianic or savior figure whose arrival resolves the conflict. All three describe a deceiving, dominating world system immediately preceding that resolution. All three describe the rebuilding or restoration of sacred structures in Jerusalem as part of the sequence. All three contain preconditions that are either already fulfilled or actively being prepared. Three traditions, three separate textual lineages, three distinct theological frameworks, written in three languages across multiple centuries in different cultural contexts, describing the same stage, the same sequence, the same territory. Now here is the analytical question, the one I'm not going to answer for you, because this is your conclusion to reach, not mine. Is this convergence the result of three independent traditions accidentally describing the same future? Is it the result of later traditions borrowing and reshaping earlier ones, a textual cross-contamination? Or is it the result of three traditions, each in their own language, each in their own framework, each describing something real, something they each received partially from a common source that saw the whole picture? I'm not telling you which answer is correct. I am telling you that when the actors currently making decisions about war and peace in the Middle East are operating from all three of these frameworks simultaneously, you need to understand all three, because the script they are following is older than any of them. And somehow, someone or something wrote all three versions of it. Thread 1. The temple that wasn't there. Here is a sentence that is going to upset a lot of people. The Western Wall in Jerusalem, the Wall of Lament, the place where millions of Christians and Jews have stood in reverence for centuries, is almost certainly not a remnant of Solomon's temple, or Herod's temple, or any temple. It is, with high probability, a wall of a Roman military installation. Now, before you close the tab, hear the evidence. Because this is not a conspiracy theory. This is archaeology. This is ancient text. And this is basic geography. Start with Jesus himself. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 2, says, standing at the temple complex, Jesus tells his disciples, not one stone here will be left upon another. Every stone thrown down. Now go to Jerusalem today. Stand at the Western Wall. Look at the stones. Some of them weigh hundreds of tons. They are very much upon one another. If you believe Jesus said what he said and meant what he said, you have a problem. The standard answer is Rome did the throwing. This is what was left. But that answer collapses under the weight of Josephus. Flavius Josephus, 1st century Jewish historian, the eyewitness to the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, describes the Roman military installation called the Antonia Fortress in his work Jewish War. He tells us explicitly that this fortress was large enough to house a full Roman legion, an entire legion, roughly 5,000 soldiers plus support personnel, equipment, stables, command infrastructure. The footprint typically attributed to the Antonia Fortress, if the Temple Mount is what it is claimed to be, cannot accommodate that. The math simply doesn't work, unless the Antonia Fortress is the Temple Mount, and the temple was somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else is the city of David, specifically the Gihon Spring. Scholars Ernest Martin and Bob Cornuke have done the most rigorous work on this. Martin's book, The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot, lays the archaeological and textual case with a precision that has never been satisfactorily refuted, only ignored. Here is the practical argument. The temple required enormous quantities of water, continuous water, for ritual purification. The priest had to be ceremonially clean. The sacrifices had to be prepared under clean conditions. The entire sacrificial system ran on humongous amounts of water. The Gihon Spring is the only substantial water source in the area. It flows. It has always flowed. It is in the city of David, below and south of the so-called Temple Mount. And here is the geography that matters. When Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane and taken through his night trial, he was brought first to the high priest, then from the high priest to Pilate, physically, in Jerusalem terrain. The city of David, where the Gihon Spring sits, where the temple almost certainly stood, is at lower elevation. The praetorium, where Pilate was stationed, sat higher. You go up to the Roman governor, you go down to the temple precinct. The physical geography of Jerusalem itself supports the location argument, not because the gospel texts use explicit directional language in those passages, but because the terrain does. The land tells the same story as the text. Now, what does this mean for the Temple Mount today? It means the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock may not be standing on sacred Jewish ground at all. Joel Richardson, one of the most serious contemporary scholars of biblical prophecy, has argued this directly. His work points to the same conclusion. The prophesied rebuilding of the Third Temple does not require the demolition of Al-Aqsa, because Al-Aqsa was never built on the temple site to begin with. If Richardson and Martin and Cornuke are right, and the archaeological and textual evidence strongly suggests that they are, then one of the most explosive assumptions in Middle Eastern geopolitics simply dissolves. The conflict over the Temple Mount may be a conflict over the wrong location. That is not a minor footnote. That is a structural revision of how we understand one of the most dangerous fault lines in the world. Jiang did not go there. He repeated the standard assumptions. He needed to go deeper. Thread 2. The Accelerationists. Here is something that is almost never said directly in geopolitical analysis. There are people in all three Abrahamic faiths who are not merely predicting the end times. They are trying to cause them, not metaphorically, operationally. They believe their religious obligation is to create the conditions that will trigger the final prophesied event, to accelerate the timeline, to push the pieces into place faster. Jiang mentioned this group. He called them Accelerationists. What he avoided saying, whether intentionally or because he did not know the precise term, is that in Christian theology, this movement has a name: dominionism. Specifically, the Seven Mountains Mandate, the New Apostolic Reformation, movements that believe Christians are called not merely to evangelize, but to take dominion over the seven spheres of society: government, media, education, economy, arts, family, religion, in order to prepare the earth for Christ's return. This is not fringe. This theology has influenced American political life at the highest levels for decades. It operates at the Tier 1 level, the conceptual worldview tier, while most analysts are watching Tier 3 politics and wondering why certain decisions make no rational sense. On the Jewish side, the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, founded in 1987, they have already manufactured the ritual objects required for temple worship. The priestly garments, the altar implements, the menorah, everything is ready. Everything is waiting. Their stated mission is the rebuilding of the third temple, not as a spiritual metaphor, as a physical construction project. On the Shia Muslim side, the theology of hastening the return of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, the hidden one, whose return in traditional Shia doctrine is preceded by a period of global chaos and conflict. There are voices within Iran's political theological establishment who do not merely await this chaos, they welcome it. They believe engineering it is an act of faith. So here we have it. Three faiths. Three separate theological acceleration programs, all running simultaneously. Now, here is where this becomes structural geopolitical analysis and not just religious commentary. When a senior Israeli cabinet minister makes a decision about the Temple Mount, you need to know whether he adheres to the Temple Institute theology. Because if he does, his decision-making calculus is not rational in the conventional Tier 3 political sense. He is operating from a Tier 1 framework that places the physical rebuilding of the temple above diplomatic consequences. When an IRGC commander makes a decision about regional conflict, you need to know whether this theology includes Mahdist acceleration. Because if it does, acceleration is not a cost. It's a feature. When an American policymaker with dominionist affiliations votes on Middle East policy, you need to know what theological endpoint he believes he is serving. Analysts who ignore this layer are not being rigorous. They are being naive and sloppy. This geopolitical chessboard has players whose moves only make sense if you understand the game they think they are playing. And the game they think they are playing is not the one being reported on the television. If this kind of analysis, structural, honest, answering to nobody but facts, is giving you real tools to understand what is happening out there, consider supporting Eagle's View on Patreon and Substack. The link is in the description below. This is what keeps this independent. Babylon and the geography of prophecy. This is a geographic thread running through biblical prophecy that almost no geopolitical analyst touches, because most geopolitical analysts have not read the text. Ancient Persia, the empire whose territorial ghost Iran is inheriting right now, through the resistance axis, through the north-south corridor, through the BRI integration, covered territory that maps with remarkable precision onto the geography of end times prophecy. Elam. Ancient Elam is southwestern Iran, Persia proper. The Euphrates corridor running through what is now Iraq, the valley of Shinar, ancient Babylon, Mavero-Nahr, sitting in the territory Iran now borders and partially influences. The book of Revelation, chapters 17 and 18, describe the fall of Babylon, a great city, a center of global commerce and political power. A system described as making all nations drunk on its influence. Now, the United Nations has been publicly discussing, in documented citable reports, the architecture of global governance for decades. The shift from a nation-state-based international system toward a world body with actual enforcement capability. Henry Kissinger wrote about it. Brzezinski wrote about it. These are not anonymous internet claims. These are on-record positions from people who shaped the post-war international order. The physical site of ancient Babylon in present-day Iraq, near Hilla, has been a UNESCO World Heritage Reconstruction project. Saddam Hussein began rebuilding it in the 1980s. The work continues after his fall. There is a documented, ongoing effort to restore the physical site. Is the United Nations going to literally relocate to Babylon next week? No. Is there a convergence of prophesied geography, current geopolitical architecture, and the physical restoration of the ancient site that serious analysts should note? Yes. And Iran sits at the center of that map, not as a peripheral player, as the geographic hinge. The territory of the ancient Persian Empire, the territory Iran is now reasserting influence over through every means available to it, is the territory that biblical prophecy describes as the stage for the final act. That is not a coincidence you need to manufacture. It is sitting in the open, waiting for someone with the right framework to look at clearly. Now, thread 3, the mark. Here we get to the part Jiang handled worst, and the part that requires the most precision. The mark of the beast, the book of Revelation, chapter 13. No one may buy or sell without it. It is placed on the right hand or the forehead. The angel in the book of Revelation, chapter 14, right in the next chapter, warns mankind explicitly. Whoever receives this mark will face irreversible divine judgment. For the last 30 years, the dominant interpretation in popular Christian culture has been that the mark is a microchip, an RFID implant, a radio frequency tag under the skin. This is the Luddite interpretation, and it has 3 fatal problems. Problem 1 is theological. If the mark is a passive radio chip, then God's capacity for redemption is blocked by a piece of silicon smaller than a grain of rice. Think about what that actually claims. The God described in Christian theology who pursues a single lost sheep across impossible terrain, who says that one soul is more precious to him than entire world, cannot reach a soul because of a frequency emitter? That is not a coherent God. That is a God whose salvation is weaker than Walmart inventory system. Problem 2, textual. The placement of the mark, right hand and forehead, deliberately mirrors the Jewish practice of tefillin, the phylacteries worn during prayer, placed on the hand and the head. The Torah instructs to bind them as a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes. They symbolize keeping God's commandments always in mind and in action, directing both thoughts and deeds toward God. The mark of the beast is the deliberate inversion of that symbol, not a passive identifier, a counter covenant, a rival binding, a declaration of allegiance encoded into the body itself. Problem 3, behavioral. Look at what the book of Revelation describes happening to the people who receive the mark. They do not become reluctant unbelievers. They do not become indifferent. They become violently, irreversibly hostile to God and to everything associated with Him. That is not a psychological state produced by a chip. Something structural has changed in who they are. So, what is it? Here is a more coherent framework, based on the text, based on the precedent within the same scriptural tradition, and based on what is now technologically possible in a way it was not 35 years ago. Go back to Genesis 6, the Nephilim, the beings produced by the corruption of the human genetic line. The theological term is imago Dei, the image of God, the capacity within human beings that makes them capable of relationship with God, capable of redemption, capable of the free choice that makes that redemption meaningful. The flood is not primarily a punishment in the conventional moral sense. It is a reset. Noah was described in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 9, as perfect in all his generations. The Hebrew word tamim, meaning uncorrupt, untarnished, wholesome. His genetic lineage was intact, and he was the last in the entire mankind. Him and his family were the last human beings. The rest of humanity's image-bearing capacity has been fundamentally compromised. The flood restored the line. Now read the mark differently. Not a passive identifier, it's a mutagen. something introduced into the human biological substrate that alters what a person fundamentally is, not through coercion, through volunteer acceptance, which is why the angel warns explicitly and why the warning matters. The choice once made is final, not because God withdrew, but because the faculty that could choose is no longer intact. This is why the marked population in Revelation does not gradually drift away from faith. They become incapable of the orientation toward God entirely and actively, viscerally opposed to it in a rabid way. The free will that makes salvation possible has not been violated. It has been eliminated, annihilated, a different category entirely. The Nephilim precedent establishes that this mechanism exists within the scriptural framework. And Jesus himself closed the loop in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 37. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now come the detractors.
This is a science fiction. You can't genetically alter the soul. Biology doesn't work like theology.
Fair question. Here's the structural response. I'm not claiming to know the precise mechanism by which a biological alteration affects spiritual ontology. I am claiming that the scriptural text describes an outcome, irreversible separation from redemptive capacity, that the RFID hypothesis simply cannot account for, and that the genetic corruption hypothesis can. The text is the evidence. The Nephilim precedent is the template. The mechanism is above my pay grade and probably above everyone's. What is not above anyone's pay grade is the infrastructure question. 35 years ago, there was no technology capable of introducing a genetic modification into the entire human population simultaneously. There was no delivery system. There was no global logistics network. There was no regulatory framework that had demonstrated the ability to override informed consent in the name of public health emergency. Now, check every box. The global mRNA delivery infrastructure has been proven. A platform capable of introducing genetic instructions into human cells was developed, manufactured at a global scale, distributed to virtually every country on Earth, and administered to billions of people within 18 months of a declared emergency. The infrastructure now exists. The regulatory precedent now also exists. The public compliance architecture has been tested and documented. I'm not claiming that the specific product deployed in 2020 and 2021 was the mark. No, I'm not saying that. The right people will draw their own conclusions from the timeline. What I am saying is structural. The logistical and technological preconditions for what Revelation 13 describes, a mark administered globally to all people that produces an irreversible ontological change, did not exist a generation ago. They exist now. Why now? This is the question that ties all three threads together. In 1987, Ronald Reagan stood at the United Nations General Assembly and told the world, quietly, almost as an aside, that if humanity faced a single existential threat from outside, our differences would vanish overnight.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe, we'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together. Well, I don't suppose we can wait for some alien race to come down and threaten us, but I think that between us we can bring about that realization. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. But I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all? We were all human beings, citizens of the world, and wouldn't we come together to fight that particular threat?
One world, one response, one government. He used the example of an alien invasion. The example is almost beside the point. The mechanism he described is not science fiction. It is political science. And it is the same mechanism that a very old text describes producing a very specific outcome, a single system of global economic and political control that no one can opt out of. Reagan just gave it a podium and a microphone. Why is everything converging at this specific moment in history? Not as a prophecy, as an inventory of observable facts. The global surveillance infrastructure, biometric identification, facial recognition, digital financial system, real-time population monitoring did not exist at scale in 1990. It does now. The global pharmaceutical delivery infrastructure, capable of reaching virtually every human being on Earth with a biological agent within a defined emergency window, did not exist in 2000. It does now. The artificial intelligence infrastructure, capable of controlling information environments, shaping public consensus, and managing behavioral compliance at population scale, did not exist in 2010. It does now. The final digitization infrastructure, the architecture for a cashless, permission-based economic system where participation can be granted or revoked, was theoretical at best in 2015. It is being implemented now as we speak in real time. The governance architecture, UN reform documents, world government proposals, multilateral enforcement frameworks that supersede national sovereignty has been in development for decades and is now further advanced than at any previous point in human history. And the geographic convergence, the ancient prophetic territories of Persia, Elam, Shinar, Babylon, are right now the active theater of a war that is redrawing the map of global trade, energy, and power. Every structural precondition in place simultaneously for the first time in human history. This is not a prophecy. This is an inventory. What you do with that inventory is your own decision. I am not here to tell you what to conclude. I am here to make sure you have seen what is actually on the table. Because the mainstream analysis, the geopolitical commentary that watches troop movements and sanctions packages and diplomatic communiques, is looking at the surface of something that goes much, much deeper. The surface matters. We cover it every week. But the depth is where the actual architecture lives. And the architecture, the Tier 1 framework driving all of this, is older than any of the actors currently performing on the stage. One last voice, the one I respect most in this conversation.
You're mixing theology and geopolitics. These are different disciplines. You're going to mislead people.
Here's my answer. Every major geopolitical actor in this conflict is operating from a Tier 1 framework, a conceptual worldview, a set of first principles about what reality is, what history means, what the end point of human civilization looks like. The Israeli cabinet members adhering to Temple Mount theology are operating from eschatology viewpoint. Documented fact. The IRGC commanders shaped by Mahdist theology are operating from eschatological viewpoint. Also documented fact. The American policymakers affiliated with dominionist movements are operating from eschatological viewpoint. Christian eschatology. Thoroughly documented. An analyst who ignores the Tier 1 framework that actors are operating from is not being rigorous. He is producing an incomplete model. I'm not preaching. I'm not predicting. I'm not prophesying. I am doing what we do here every week. I am reading the structure beneath the surface. And right now, the structure is telling a story that is very, very old, very specific, and moving faster than almost anyone is tracking. If you want the deeper breakdown, the full archaeological case for the temple location, the complete documented record of dominionist influence on American Middle East policy, and the textual analysis of the mark in its original Greek, that is in this week's Substack. Link is in the description. And if Eagle's View is the place where you come to understand not just what is happening, but why the framework looks the way it does, consider Patreon. That is what keeps this channel answering to nobody but the evidence. So, 3 scripts, written in 3 languages, across 3 separate traditions, describing the same stage, the same sequence, the same territory, now being read and acted upon simultaneously by 3 sets of actors in real time. The temple almost certainly was not where most people think it was. The evidence, archaeological, textual, and geographic, points to the city of David and the Gihon Spring. The Wall of Lament is almost certainly a wall of a Roman military camp. And Joel Richardson, Ernest Martin, and Bob Cornuke have done the scholarly work that makes this case seriously and rigorously. The Accelerationists are real. They are active, and they are operating in all 3 Abrahamic faiths simultaneously. Understanding this is not optional for anyone trying to understand why Middle East policy decisions are made the way they are. The mark of the beast is almost certainly not a microchip. The genetic mutagen interpretation, the one that accounts for the Nephilim precedent and the irreversible behavioral transformation the book of Revelation describes, is theologically coherent in ways the RFID interpretation simply is not. And the infrastructure to deliver something like it globally now exists in a way it never did before. And Persia, the civilization Iran is reasserting right now, through war, through trade corridors, through regional architecture, sits at the geographic center of all of it. That is not coincidence. That is structure. Look at it clearly, and then you tell me. This is a wrap for today, my friends. I'll see you next week.